Okay, should we do this? Welcome everybody to This Is Good, in which our little ragtag group of New York Times journalists identifies a piece of journalism that we're impressed by and get together and talk about it. And this installment is about pretty much the only thing that has broken through during the coronavirus pandemic, Tiger King. Many months before the Netflix docuseries was released in March, Texas Monthly had a very long, authoritative piece written by Leif Reigstad. He'll be joining us in a few minutes. But right now, it's our weekly panel. We have two subscribers, New York Times subscribers, Ruthie Darling and Amelia Coet, and the New York Times journalist with us from just outside of his pottery shed, Mike Schmidt, Pui-Wing Tam, the deputy business editor, Vanessa Friedman, the fashion critic, who I think is probably the only New York Times employee who doesn't have self-loathing when she gets dressed in the morning, Azam Ahmed, and Sam Dolnick from the masthead. So, does anybody have anything they want to say about this article vis-a-vis the Netflix documentary? Who wants to start?
I only watched one episode of Tiger King on Netflix, so I'm maybe not the best qualified, but what struck me about the Texas Monthly piece was how Joe Exotic came across very much more as a sympathetic sort of personality, a sympathetic character. And you could really see that he had a very tragic background, being sort of disowned by his dad and the death of his brother and so on and so forth. So that immediately jumped out at me. And I'm not, others who've watched the series probably can see maybe even a sharper contrast.
I felt exactly the same way. When I watched the series, I just thought these people are all awful. And when you read the story, you really remembered that, characters don't spring fully fledged into their kind of worst contexts, but they all come from someplace. And I felt like that's one of the things that the story really could do in written form.
Yeah, I watched a few episodes of the documentary, but I couldn't get all the way through because it felt more like good television than good journalism. Yeah. There were manipulative elements of it that sort of raised suspense, raised questions they knew they weren't going to answer, but were titillating to viewers. And yeah, by the end of it, I felt like there was no real sympathy for anyone. And that didn't feel like rigor, it felt more like design.
I've never been
I remember in the,
Oh, go ahead, Ruthie, yeah.
I don't remember in the TV series there being any mention of Joe's suicide attempt and subsequent rehabilitation. And hearing that backstory, it definitely put him as a more sympathetic character and gave a lot more context as to why, he began this course in life with good intentions. And sort of, that was the interesting part of the article for me, that he really started from a place of good and sort of just got corrupted along the way, which is, I think, something that the documentary just completely ignored. So I love that about the article.
I have a question for, I've never been a proper reporter, only an editor, and I think all of you have been reporters at one time or another. When you have a story, maybe you've never encountered something quite like this, but when you have a story that is just like an embarrassment of riches and you have so many delicious facts to introduce, when you were I got to the point where it was like every paragraph was staggering, and I almost became numb to really remarkable revelations. And I'm going to ask Leif about this when he joins us. In a weird way, it feels almost problematic. Like there's too much outrageousness to bake into one story. Did any of the reporters, writers in this group have thoughts about that as you're reading it?
I know what you mean. There's so much to unfold and so many hysterical details that how do you kind of make a meal out of them? Usually you get like one of those shards and you try to kind of build up for a few paragraphs to get to the punchline, but here like every sentence what was a punchline. And it felt kind of, the writing kind of felt restrained to me because of that. Like I think another writer would have really played this up much more gonzo, much more look at this, oh my god, almost rubbernecking, which is I think what a bunch of people here are referencing the tone of the documentary. But I was impressed that the story didn't have that tone at all. I didn't think it was really like just kind of laying out this world that I didn't even know existed, this exotic animal trading in really kind of meticulous detail. And I thought, let the texture of that world speak for itself.
Yeah, I agree. It read very briskly to me, and it was sort of a writer and reporter's dream, because what didn't this story have? It had pretty much everything that you could ever dream of, and lots more besides. And it was laid out, the pacing was fast. I mean, it was a long piece, but you just sort of whizzed through it. And there weren't a lot of quotes. I thought that was interesting, that he didn't have a lot of the voices until maybe closer to the end. And I thought it was very interesting that he introduced first person very late in the story. And I was curious why he decided to do that. Maybe
why he decided to do it at all, or why he decided to do it so late into the piece?
Probably both. It was sort of, it kind of, as a storytelling thing, you're like, oh, suddenly the writer is in this. In some ways he didn't need to be, but it kind of made it all a little bit more personal as well. So the structure I thought was very interesting.
I also was kind of interested in the way that it was written. So many stories like this, it's verite scene stitched together with context. And this instead was just one narrative that kind of rolled through, almost as if, from the reporting, he's witnessed a lot of this firsthand, but when you read it, it almost reads like a short story, something that's just unfolding. And I wondered if that was because if there's too much observation, you risk the tone can go too high, too low. And if it was meant to kind of, I guess, mute the incredible nature of the content, like what Sam was saying, other writers might have been more Gonzo style, but Leif, it looked like he took it and just wanted to stitch it in one coherent story without a lot of quotes, without a lot of observed interactions between Joe and his partners, and even sort of taking us out and like focusing in on one of Joe's particular threats on his video, or maybe one that he saw.
Yeah,
Amelia and Ruthie, I'm curious. Go ahead, Sam.
I was just saying, it seemed like he wanted to arrive somewhere at the end, because I found a dozen places where I probably would have attempted to stop and dig deeper. His relationship with all of these young men, he married how many 19-year-old men? And it was presented almost matter of factly. Like, I would have tried to understand, wait, what are these marriages? Or Carol Baskin and murdering her husband or not murdering her husband. Like, that could have been its own giant story. But he kind of moved past it because he had somewhere to go, it felt like. And there was kind of a story he had in his mind.
Yeah, I was interested in the fact too that he stayed away from the politics of this question, because like animal rights, exotic animals, like there's so many emotions and issues surrounding that, particularly now, and he really did not touch that, which I was sort of interested in as a decision. And maybe it was because the narrative was so compelling, or there were so many details to get in, that he felt like it would take it into a completely different space. But I did feel like there was all this opportunity to connect it to what was going on right now.
Yeah. Ruthie, Amelia, I think you two said that you had seen the documentary before you read this piece, is that right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And what was that experience like? Did it completely reshape what you had understood about this story, or how did it feel reading it after the doc?
It was hard to not remember how the documentary had portrayed the similar instances, and this one seemed much more thoughtful and restrained, while the documentary almost made people cartoonish. And so it was hard to sort of take the article as it was. I sort of wish that I had found or knew about the article first, and then I could look at the documentary as a contrast instead of the other way around.
Right.
Yeah, I felt the same. Having seen the documentary, obviously I knew this story so well. So having read the article, it was like I was reading it going, yeah, I know all this, which was a shame. But I did love his more measured and, sensitive approach that he took in really describing Joe's life sort of from start to where it is currently. That seemed to be the thread that ran through it for me, whereas the documentary was more of just sort of throwing everything at you from all different perspectives. This was much more linear, and it was easier to follow in that respect.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I watched the first episode and had literally nightmares that night and never watched anything ever again because I was afraid I was going to get eaten by a tiger. But what I think when you contrast the two, you sort of realize that in print, if you're going to do a true print story, the truth is much harder than what we often see in television or at the surface. And the whole country, well, more people in the country will have seen the Netflix thing than the nuanced nature of the article. And I think that happens in so many different types of news, where the narrative that a lot of people get is the simplistic one, and the truth is in the print, which is fewer people get to.
Is there, do you have something in mind when you say that? Like, is there an article of yours or some line of reporting that you've done that was maybe bastardized or manipulated or somehow just
just the most obvious one that people would understand is just the Trump story. There's like these broad narratives about the Trump story. One part of the country has one view and the other, but when you get down to the actual facts of what went on and sort of these, like I put the more recent investigation stuff that's been in the news, it's like far harder, more detailed, nuanced story than it's made out in the broad brushstrokes. And I kind of saw this. I'm like, well, all these people that saw this Netflix thing are going to see it in this sort of one way, which is probably overly simplistic. And when you have to do the hard work of actually writing it and getting into the details, it's so much more gray. And look, everything can't have gray. We can't spend thousands of words explaining everything in like the newspaper, every day. But when you go to write, it's much, if you're going to do it right, it's a harder story to tell.
Yeah. I wrote a magazine story a couple of years ago that was turned into a movie. And in the movie version, there were 2 threesomes. In the magazine story, there were no threesomes. But they thought 2 was enough.
I don't know, maybe if Joe Exotic was your character, you'd be fine.
Oh my gosh. And a reminder that we have the chat forum open for anybody who's watching, listening in. Feel free to throw some questions or comments in there and we'll try to.
I'm curious about, for you guys, for me, one of the things driving me through the documentary series is what happens to this guy. And here he started at the end with him getting arrested. And I'm curious, if you guys were editing this piece, did you like that way, or would you have told it more chronologically?
Personally, I think it worked. And you could kind of feel what the Florida life was like. I thought it was very evocative, the line about how Joe felt this knee drive into him when he was drive into his back when he was arrested, and then it sort of flashes back after that. I thought it was effective. We start at the end and then sort of rewind. So I liked that.
But speaking to the notion you were saying before about having so many rich facts, I think if you have so many rich facts, they sort of all cloud each other out. So if you come out at the beginning and give people sort of, what the end result is, it's probably easier to see the story as you go along, because like if you have all these rich facts and you're not sure what they're building towards, I think it would be more confusing.
Right.
I think it helped to frame our understanding of him, because it was like he had found peace. Like he was having a kind of calm, quiet life from the beginning. It wasn't like he'd moved to Florida to like start some other nefarious scheme. He really seemed to be in a nice place. And then you go back to how he got there. So I think it changes how you think about him.
I think there's kind of an inherent difference between trying to write, as everyone said, a print article and do a Netflix show. But one of the things that I think pulled people through the Netflix show was this constant revelations like, holy shit, what happened? And you lose a little bit of that when you start off with the guy getting arrested. But again, you have to get people hooked earlier. They're not going to give you the time to watch a full episode of revelations and insanity. And I imagine in the readership, more people reading the Texas Monthly had heard of Joe Exotic than a broad international audience watching Netflix. So you have a little bit more time to live in this absurd kind of crazy world of big cat zoos.
Should we have Leif join us now? Yeah?
Yeah.
Can you jump in? Hey, man.
Hey, guys. Thanks
Hey,
for
well.
having me.
So this is Leif Reigstad joining us from Austin, and we have a million questions for him, and I'm sure some folks out in the audience do too, so feel free to throw them in the chat. Leif, you mentioned before we went live that, so you wrote this piece probably, more than a year ago for Texas Monthly, and you hadn't watched the documentary until last night, is that right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Just riff, tell us your thoughts.
Oh boy. Well, yeah, I had figured that it had, sensationalized the story, a bit more than, most of the kind of print magazine stories that had been published before the documentary came out. But I don't think I was really prepared for just how.
Oh, sorry to interrupt, but yours was the first big written story on him, right?
Yeah. I think 3 or 4 other ones came out after that. New York Magazine, National Geographic, longreads.com all had, and I think the Daily Beast also had similar kind of long form stories. And, even kind of going back and reading all of those, they were all pretty much the same, in terms of describing kind of Joe's rise and fall, his feud with Carol Baskin. But then the kind of documentary comes out and it tells a different narrative that's, not really grounded in the facts that, I found in my reporting. I don't know, it's kind of disappointing to have that, be the one that gets like 34 million viewers on Netflix. And, now, a lot of Americans think that Joe Exotic is, innocent and, was framed, and they think Carol Baskin killed her husband, and those things just are not true.
Let's pause right there. So in your article, you seem to be particularly careful about how you dealt with the Carol Baskin husband issue. Some of the language you used was, suggested that, unfounded. Can you walk us through how you navigated that and then what you saw in the Netflix series?
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, there was just no conclusive evidence, pointing to anyone that, had anything to do with Don Lewis's murder or disappearance. It's a mystery, and there's just no hard evidence to really suggest any of the kind of theories that have been floated by, people who have these underlying motives that weren't really represented in the documentary the way that they needed to be for viewers to understand the full context of, where this stuff was coming from. The way they kind of framed, what was ultimately circumstantial evidence, that they used to kind of suggest Carol may have killed her husband. They kind of buffered that with these unchecked, uncorroborated claims, without offering hard proof, hard evidence from people who, had disputes with Carol Baskin and had, significant motivations to see her, accused of murder in a popular Netflix documentary. And the documentarians, I mean, they didn't really portray that responsibly or accurately at all.
I'm curious, to me, watching the film, the main theme that I saw, the takeaway was this hunger for fame. He would do anything to be seen. And I think that's representative of a lot of our time and our era. And he is this crazy extreme example of it. I'm curious, in your reporting, was that the through line too? Is that what you observed living in his world all that time?
Oh yeah. I mean, I think, what we really wanted to do with the story is just kind of trace how he became this persona, this Joe Exotic persona, and how, his kind of pursuit of money, of fame, kind of ultimately led to his downfall. And, I don't know if they really, again, I don't want to keep comparing stuff to the documentary, but, I don't know if they really did a good job of showing that, because they didn't really, I mean, they didn't really flesh out his kind of downfall, I guess, in what led to his kind of his arrest and his conviction. I don't know. I feel like they were kind of casting doubt on his guilt in a way that wasn't what was kind of reflected in, especially the trial and a lot of the video and audio evidence that was presented during the trial.
Did you feel sorry for him Again, just sort of going back to our observations that he came across as much more of a sort of sympathetic and tragic figure. Did you, was that what you intended to, is that how you intended to portray him? And is that what your reporting showed?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you can kind of look at how he got to, being Joe Exotic and getting that persona, and kind of look at how that's rooted in, ultimately like traumatic experiences in his life. And that doesn't excuse kind of his actions and the decisions that he made, as Joe Exotic that, were really destructive, not only to himself ultimately, but to the people around him. I mean, people like John Finley, Travis Maldonado, people who were kind of sucked into his orbit because he had this very charismatic, cult leader-like kind of persona. And it just kind of absorbed everyone who came into his orbit.
Leif, a couple quick questions. We have one submitted from somebody in the audience asking do you happen to know if the traffic to the article on Texas Monthly's website went up after the documentary ran? And also, could you just talk about the structure of the story and the writing of the story? We were mentioning before you hopped on how, you have just this crazy number of fascinating, mind-blowing facts along the plot, and like, how do you go about laying them out in a way that gives justice to all of them? Yeah,
so first part of your question, traffic has definitely gone up. It's been, I don't know, for a couple of weeks after in my time frame might be off a little bit because my sense of time is kind of warped right now. But I think the story was among our most read stories for, at least 2 or 3 weeks after the documentary came out. And it's kind of circled back now for, whatever reason. And then, for the second part of your question, yeah, I mean, it was kind of a struggle to manage, all of the bizarre, interesting details that, we found during the reporting process. I think the first draft that I turned in was like, I want to say it was about 15,000 words. And then we whittled it down to about, 7,000 because it was just, it was unreadable. And I don't know, I felt like I had to kind of get all of my reporting on the page first, just to get a sense of, how we might approach the story after that. It was really a process of kind of deciding like what was most important to show, who Joe was and how kind of he got to the point where he's at right now. And then to, show just how kind of strange and, troubled the world that he created was. And so we tried to limit, the details that we included to, make sure we didn't lose the readers at all throughout that piece. Because I don't know about you guys, but when I was watching the documentary, I had trouble kind of staying with it because it was just too much. It was just like getting hit in the head with all this weird stuff every minute. It was just a little overwhelming. So we tried to kind of pare it down in a way that was easier for people to actually process and understand.
So what ended up on the cutting room floor?
Oh man. I mean, I don't think anything that we cut, should have been cut. But I mean, stuff about his various political, campaigns, we just didn't put that in there because it just wasn't. I don't know. It just didn't seem that important. What else? A lot of kind of bigger picture stuff about the exotic animal industry and the kind of animal rights issues at play there didn't make it into the story. And I think part of that too is because we, as a Texas-focused magazine, we wanted to focus on the Texas connections, and that was really mostly through Joe because of his background here. So a lot of kind of bigger picture stuff got cut that wasn't as closely related to that.
I bet every reporter could trace. Oh, I'm sorry, Ruthie, go.
Oh, I was just going to ask how you stumbled upon this story, and as a writer, how you felt as you were sort of beginning your research and finding out all of these amazing facts and thinking, I've just like hit a gold mine here. What was that? How did you find him and what was the process like?
Good question.
Yeah, I mean, it's not that exciting actually. I just, I think I read a local news story that had gotten reprinted in, some Texas news outlet just after he was arrested. And I saw his mugshot and I, read the little blurb that kind of described, why he was arrested and what he'd done. And I just kind of went down a rabbit hole after that. I saw all of the videos he had posted on his YouTube channel over the last, I don't know, 5 to 10 years. And I just saw that, man, even if I never get to interview Joe, there's still so much access here that's been granted because he's had his life on camera essentially for the last, 5 to 10 years. So I knew that there was a lot of potential there to tell a long kind of narrative story.
Azam, you're awfully quiet. Everything okay, man?
Everything's fine. Actually, what I wanted to ask, I mentioned this before. In the narrative, it's such a clean chronological narrative, aside from the beginning, obviously, where you start with the arrests. And I was wondering, were you tempted to use some of the verite moments that you saw, that you firsthand witnesses, like him arguing with someone or reflective of his character, or was there just so much content, the only way to organize it and get to a coherent narrative was just to almost like use narrative exposition to kind of explain who this guy is?
Yeah, I mean, it was a little bit of both. I think we looked at each kind of strange detail or scene that we had in the story in the original drafts. And, at the end of the day, it was a lot of it was kind of just stunts for the camera, right? Like I really wanted to include that Shaquille O'Neal visited the zoo and pet tigers. But, at the end of the day, that scene didn't really do much to kind of show who Joe was or what that world was like, And so a lot of the details that we left out kind of boiled down to that, being the case. But the other thing too was, we wanted to make sure that we weren't giving a platform to people who, were not credible and weren't, gonna help our readers kind of understand what actually happened here. And so it was kind of easy to go through and cut like stuff that just didn't check out, or that wasn't, pretty clearly wasn't going to be, at least provable.
So it doesn't sound like you have a super generous opinion of the documentary series, but in watching it, was there anything about it that made you think, I wish I had done this differently, or I wish I'd included that, or did it, I don't know, impress you or inspire you in any which way?
Yeah. I mean, I like that they included so many voices from, people who had worked at the zoo. I mean, that's something that I wanted to do, but ultimately I just didn't get that access, didn't have that opportunity. And that was kind of important to show, what this kind of meant to them, what their jobs there and living there, what that was like, both kind of how it, working with animals kind of inherently helped them work through things that had kind of brought them to the zoo, right? Like the sort of traumatic backgrounds that bring someone to a bus stop in, Oklahoma City, where Joe finds them and gives them a job at the zoo. And I thought that was pretty interesting that they kind of shed some more light on that, like just what drew people to him. And then, kind of showing the conditions that they lived in too. I mean, I didn't really know totally what, some of the homes at the zoo looked like. I never saw pictures of the inside, and people that I talked to who had lived there, they weren't really able to kind of describe it in very much detail, just kind of what it was like, the kind of, squalor that it looked like they were living in, and the small wages that they were living off of. So I think that was one kind of, good part of the documentary, is how they kind of showed just what life was like for the people who lived at that zoo.
Right. And you knew the documentary was being made as you were reporting?
Oh yeah. They were, the documentarians were in the courtroom, sitting a couple rows away from me, and they had their cameras out interviewing, John Rinke, outside the courtroom and all that stuff. So yeah, we knew that everyone knew that they were, working on a documentary about Joe.
Right.
Can you talk about your decision to switch into first person closer to the end of the story? And was that, what were you trying to achieve with that? And had you planned that from, when you laid out the story?
Yeah, I don't think I had planned that originally. I'm not a big fan of writing in the first person, mostly because I don't think anyone really cares what I have to say. But I think we made the switch there because, we wanted to take the reader, through the zoo, as though they're kind of looking at it through my eyes, right? Because I went there, I saw it firsthand. And I think that's kind of an important way to show that, like this is what it actually looks like. And then, part of the reason too was in that last section, we wanted to show kind of how Joe talks to a reporter when he forgets maybe that the recorder, the tape recorder was on. There are a couple quotes in there that, I think were kind of revelatory of what he's like when the camera's not rolling, which again is something that I think the documentary didn't really show. I mean, and they had that opportunity because there was video and footage that was played during the trial of Joe, you know, being recorded by, you know, people who were working for the feds, and they chose kind of not to include some of the most damning evidence that came straight from Joe's mouth.
So Juliet McCurr, our beloved sports writer, is asking how long it took you to report the story.
So, oh man, that's a good question. I think I found out about it, I don't remember if he was arrested in like September or October or August. It was right after that. I had kind of, you know, done some pre-reporting, done some research. And then I think he was scheduled to go to trial in January of that year. Maybe it was December. And I was, you know, planning to go to Oklahoma City and kind of, you know, do the bulk of the reporting during that trip while at the trial. But it kept getting delayed, and I think, you know, the trial didn't happen for, I don't know, until February or March. And then we turned the story around pretty quickly after that. We knew that there was a lot of competition. We wanted to make sure that we had kind of the first one that could stand as, you know, the record, at least for what happened there. So I think it published in May. So it probably took about 2 or 3 months, I think, to actually put it together, which was definitely, it was difficult just because there was so much to kind of condense into a feature magazine story.
Right.
But
so Sam mentioned that an article he wrote was turned into a major motion picture, and now he's at the point where if a story isn't at that, if he doesn't think it could become a major motion picture, he doesn't even deign to work on it. After having this piece become this like world-beating documentary, has your editorial sensibility changed? Now do you look at stories and think, could this become a huge documentary hit or not? Or should I do it or not?
Not really. And, you know, I wasn't really thinking, you know, when I wrote this story that it had kind of the potential for, you know, a movie or a documentary or anything like that. And I don't know why, because like it clearly did, but I wasn't really thinking about that at the time. And I think now, you know, you can't help but think whether, you know, the stories that you're pitching and that you're thinking about would work as like a movie or TV show or documentary or anything like that, or a podcast, you know, just because I think there's so much kind of fluidity between forms now. But I don't know. I mean, if that's kind of the version that it would have to be a successful documentary on Netflix, then, you know, I don't know if I really want any of my stories to kind of end up that way in the future. But
right. This has been really, really great. Does anybody else have any questions or comments they want to?
I had a question.
Yeah, please.
As a reporter, when you're working on this piece, are you only working on this Joe Exotic story, or are you having to write about various other things going on in Texas? Like, you know, how does that kind of reporting work? Are you able to focus on it, or do you have to keep on top of other things too?
Yeah, I was allowed to pretty much focus on that at the time. I don't think I had published too much else around, you know, during the reporting there. I think, again, a lot of that was a product of just, you know, my editors knew that we wanted to get it out soon, so they kind of just let me go to work on it, which, you know, I appreciate. But yeah, I don't think I was juggling too much else there. I was pretty much just focused on that one. And I mean, I kind of had to be too, because it was just there were just so many rabbit holes to go down. You know, it was hard to kind of manage time when you're, you know, looking at 10 years worth of, you know, YouTube videos and USDA violations and that sort of thing. But I mean, it was fun, and I'm you know, glad that I had the opportunity to just kind of really dive into it.
I have one more question. Sorry. What was the fact-checking process like? Because I mean, you talk about unreliable narrators. Like every single character in your story seems like you would just have to double check and triple check every single thing they say.
Oh yeah, no, we did. I mean, you know, I did extensive background research on just about everyone who was included in the story as a voice, and you know, we tried to present them, you know, including as much context as we could, so readers could kind of judge for themselves whether, you know, what was being said. Sorry, what was being said was that
a tiger cub?
It was, yeah. So, sorry about that, but yeah, I mean, the fact checking was really difficult, and you know, shout out to Emily McCullough, who was the fact checker on this. She did a really fantastic job, and a lot of it was based on, you know, court testimony and, stuff that people had, sworn in court to be true. So that helped to kind of, give us a bit more confidence, I guess, in the reporting there.
Along the lines of your cat, one question I had. So half of, what is it, more cats are in captivity than are in the wild, correct?
Yeah.
If there's probably not a lot of zoos like this, so where are those cats?
There actually are a lot of zoos like this. I don't know how many private roadside zoo owners they included in the documentary, but that should give you kind of just a sense of how prevalent this is. And it's not just, people who are running these kind of ramshackle roadside zoo operations. It's also people who, have a tiger in their apartment in Harlem, which, actually happened like, I don't know, 5 or 10 years ago or something like that. I mean, there's really not much regulation in that area. So it's kind of hard to tell, I don't think anyone really knows where these animals are. There's just, this is kind of a Wild West, but.
Very cool. Tremendous. Well, congrats on being first in many ways. It's impressive. And I guess we'll see everybody next week. This has been really, really lovely. Thank you, guys.
Thanks.
Thank you, Leif.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Bye-bye.